Well, we're a few days removed from the Super Tuesday elections, but the fallout continuing. Now that we seem to have put the primary season behind us and we're moving on to the general election, what did we learn from Super Tuesday? Joining me to talk a little bit more about that is Erin Covey. She's with the Cook Political Report. You can follow her on X at @ERCovey. Erin, thank you for joining me here on the DC Debrief. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. And, I think it's pretty clear that Trump had a very good Super Tuesday. He only lost the one state, only lost Vermont, and most of the margins were very large. I think just objectively speaking, it's pretty clear Donald Trump had himself a good night. But moving forward now, looking ahead, what specifically do you think his campaign feels, what do they feel best about based off of the results that they got from Super Tuesday?
Right. So, to absolutely no one's surprise, Trump did very well Tuesday night. And at this point, both campaigns are now fully in general election mode. With Nikki Haley dropping out officially, that makes Trump the presumptive nominee, and he is now going to be focused on the general election exclusively. And then, as far as President Biden's campaign goes, he was always kind of running in a general election mode and not focusing on his primary opponents at all. But now that Dean Phillips is out, that further clears the field.
Right. So the ground has been paved, in other words,
Yes.
now for these two gentlemen for a rematch of 2020, the rematch seemingly very few Americans actually want. And yet both men cleaned house pretty early here in the primary election cycle. It's not always this way where you have these two guys by the end of Super Tuesday fully charged and you have your presumptive nominees, not technically speaking, but it seems obvious that that's what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
I do want to talk about some of the swing states that Republican voters seemed pretty divided in. I know exit polling in a few of them seem to indicate that Haley voters may not be so quick to jump to Trump now that Haley is out. How concerned should the Trump campaign be based on some of the numbers that came out from places saying like Virginia and North Carolina and California?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's always difficult to really compare primary electorates to general election electorates because they're going to be so different. And so that applies to all these races up and down the ballot. But yeah, I think, what we've seen from exit polls is that a lot of Nikki Haley's supporters were also folks who voted for Biden in 2020 or even voted for Clinton in 2016. And so a lot of her support to begin with was made up of probably a lot of committed Democratic voters or independents who were likely to vote Democratic anyway. And, I think that's kind of why a lot of the polls we saw of the Republican primaries underestimated her margin a little bit. Like we kind of saw that across the board in Iowa, New Hampshire, et cetera. And I think that was because they were undercounting the amount of Democrats who were switching their party registration, or if they were voting in an open primary state, were just voting on a Republican ballot to support Haley. So I think a lot of those voters are going to still be supporting Biden. But, it is a sign of concern for Trump. Nikki Haley did well in areas where you would expect her to do well and where Trump is not popular, largely suburban areas, that are white, more affluent, and have been moving increasingly away from the Republican Party in the post-Trump era.
And now with Haley out of the race, there's going to be a race to scoop up the Haley supporters. And as you mentioned, some of them may be Democratic supporters and will now shift their attention over to Joe Biden. Certainly President Biden is courting those Haley supporters, some of those Haley voters in a statement after she dropped out of the race on Wednesday. But for President Trump, back in January, he seemed reluctant to invite Haley supporters and specifically Haley donors over to the MAGA wing of the party, or even just to vote for him in November. In a statement after Haley dropped out, Trump seemed more receptive on Truth Social to bringing some of the Haley supporters over to his side, to the Republican Party. What is the push-pull there between what the former president said back in January and what he had to say this week?
Right. I mean, back in January, he was still treating the race to a certain extent as if it was a real primary, and had to deal with his primary opponents first before focusing on general election mode. But at this point, he's going to need a certain segment of those Nikki Haley voters if he wants to win a lot of these swing states. And I think that that's why you're seeing him maybe extend more of an olive branch now than he did previously. So I think that is pretty much the explanation for that.
And looking at President Biden's Super Tuesday, he won every race except for American Samoa. And Dean Phillips now dropped out of the race. So the president and his path to the nomination clearly was never really in doubt, but
Yeah.
certainly, all of that has been pushed aside. But there has been this groundswell of protest against President Biden, the uncommitted vote in places like Michigan and Minnesota, where you have a higher Muslim population, protesting the way the Biden White House has engaged with Israel and Gaza. Is that a concern? And how big a concern is that for the White House and for the Biden campaign here over the next few months?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. Again, it's really hard to draw direct comparisons between primary results and general election results. So, a decent chunk of those uncommitted voters might be voting for Biden anyway. And maybe that was never in question for them. And this was a protest vote for them in the primary specifically. But, there's probably a significant chunk of those voters who aren't going to vote for Biden at this point. And are really frustrated with him. And that includes a lot of Muslim voters, but it also includes just the broader Arab American community, a lot of younger voters, a lot of progressive voters as well. And so this is definitely something that the Biden campaign is having to address. And I think you'll hear the president talk about this issue a little bit in a State of the Union speech tonight. It's going to be mostly focused probably on domestic issues as it typically is, but I know that he's going to be talking about Gaza and Israel as well.
Yeah, certainly that's going to be a big topic. And I know at the Cook Political Report, you guys do a phenomenal job keeping track of where the different states are leaning in terms of leaning Republican, leaning Democrat. Is it more dark red, dark blue, or in which of the swing states at the moment? We've seen polling in some of these swing states, some of these battleground states, and a lot of these states that Biden won narrowly 2, 3, 4 points 4 years ago, he's now trailing Donald Trump. Understanding there's still a long way to go here in this race, and a lot of different things can happen over the course of. I mean, we got a baseball season to get through before we even get to
Right.
anybody voting in November.
Yeah.
But that all being said, certainly some warning signs it looks like for President Biden, as he seems to be trailing in some of these battleground states. But how sticky are those numbers? How seriously should we be taking some of these polling numbers in some of these battleground states right now?
Yeah, so we are still 8 months out. A lot can change. These polls are not automatically predictive of results in November. Polls never are predictive. They're just a snapshot of a certain moment in time. But, at this point, I think this should be probably even greater cause for concern because we've seen that Biden and Trump's numbers have been pretty stable over the last couple of years. Voters know who these people are. A lot of opinions around them are pretty solidified. And Biden's approval rating has been hovering around the high 30s for the past couple of months. It hasn't been right side up since 2021. And this is definitely something that the campaign, the closer it gets to November, is being forced to reckon with. But, I think in terms of those swing state polls specifically, I would be surprised if you see Trump winning by large margins in any of these states. We expect them ultimately to be close. We have them rated as toss-ups at the presidential level. And so that includes Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, all the usual suspects there. And we expect the race to still be ultimately a close race between Trump and Biden. I'll also say at this point, right now, Biden, the race is a referendum on Biden and his presidency as the incumbent. But the campaign is hoping to be able to make it more of a choice election between Biden and Trump. Obviously, Trump is kind of in a pseudo-incumbent position just because he was formerly the president. So it'll be interesting to see once the campaign messaging actually amps up and you start to see the TV ads. Right now, Biden has a really large cash on hand advantage over Trump in general. So that's another reason we expect a lot of these polls to tighten. But it's certainly going to be close, and there's definitely cause for concern in a lot of these states just because Biden barely won a lot of these swing states last time, and he's in a much worse place image-wise right now. So definitely should be raising some alarm bells.
This may be more of an abstract question, but I wonder if the continuing proliferation of social media and the ability for pretty much anybody to have their voices heard and their opinions heard on social media, whether or not that takes away some of the inherent advantage that an incumbent president might have. For example, tonight, as you mentioned, the president is going to deliver his State of the Union speech, but really at any time during the campaign trail, the president can capture the attention of the nation by calling a primetime press conference. That is just part of the power of the incumbency. Someone like Donald Trump doesn't necessarily have that same kind of power, but we have seen that the reach of social media gives a non-incumbent, gives somebody else maybe more of a reach than they would have had, say, if they would like maybe 15, 20 years ago, when you would have, even when Obama was running for a second term. Social media has grown even more since then. Do you get the sense that there is still that inherent value in the incumbency as there used to be, or has that been chipped away a little bit over the last few years?
I mean, it's definitely been chipped away, and I think it's due to a variety of factors. Social media might be one of them. It certainly gives a lot more power to insurgent outsider candidates, regardless of what party they're in. But I think largely, in America particularly, partisanship has been so solidified that it has been a couple of years since any president has been largely popular among both parties. And we saw this with Trump's approval rating, too. It was also pretty steady throughout his presidency, and it was underwater for most of it as well. But not quite as underwater as Biden is at this point in the cycle. But he was still underwater. Obama's popularity at this point wasn't great. Again, still a little higher than Biden's. But this is the environment that we're in now as a country. And then I'll even just say, like, globally, a lot of leaders in general have pretty
Yeah.
low approval ratings. It's not just Biden. It's,
Yeah.
looking at Macron in France, et cetera. There are quite a few leaders who are really struggling right now. And I think that just has to do more with larger shifts and frustrations with the state of the world.
Last thing on the presidential election, and I do want to ask you about some. I know you cover the House, and I want to ask you a couple of questions there, and about some of the Senate primary races that we saw. But RFK Jr. polling, I don't know, anywhere from, I've seen 8 to 13 to 15%, depending on where you have it nationally in some states. How are you guys tracking RFK Jr. and the effect that he's having on the campaign, or that he could have on the campaign? Because it doesn't seem like he's going to go away, and he's not a 2%, 3% guy in a lot of these different polls. When he's thrown into the mix, he does show up there, and it's not a scant 0.5% margin.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely something that's cause for concern. It's really interesting because at this point, it's not clear if he would draw more votes away from Trump or from Biden, just because his support kind of extends to both parties, and a lot of disaffected voters in both parties who are looking at him as a more interesting option at this point. I think right now what we're really tracking is, okay, how many ballots is he actually going to be on by the time we get to November? And he's had some success. He's starting that process with a couple of states. He's now on the ballot. But we'll see how many he's actually on by the time we get to November. And I think, yeah, this is another factor that is difficult to gauge right now this early on. And once, Biden and Trump actually start focusing on the general election, I think that his margins will probably shrink. But we'll see. He's not really in a position, and no third party candidate is in a real position to win a presidential race in this country, but they can take a significant chunk of the vote and act as a spoiler for either candidate.
Yeah, so far it seems like he's been equally ignored by both sides, but we'll see whether or
Yes.
not
Yeah.
that continues here over the course of
Yeah.
the next few months. Looking at some of these House races, it seemed to me the most interesting story. It was some of these races in which you had some MAGA Republicans, some Trump-backed Republicans running against some more establishment Republican candidates that were really supported by some big donors. What races did you see in some of these GOP primaries that caught your eye? Some results that you thought are worth following.
Yeah, it was interesting. There were a lot of open seats in deep red territory last night or Tuesday night that I was following along with. There were also a couple of vulnerable Republican incumbents. So you had Tony Gonzalez in West Texas. He's relatively more moderate compared to a lot of his other peers in the Republican conference. He voted in support of the bipartisan gun control bill after the Uvalde shooting, which is also in his district. And so you saw him, he had 4 primary opponents, and he got stuck in a runoff because he failed to get the 50% of the vote you need in Texas to automatically win the primary. So he's now going to be facing Brandon Herrera at the end of May. Herrera is running to the right of Gonzalez, as all these opponents were. He is a YouTuber. I believe his handle is like the AK guy or something. He also owns like a gun store in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Interesting character. I think Gonzalez certainly still favored to win that race. But that's one race where you've definitely seen the more establishment wing of the party brush up against the more MAGA wing. I will say though, across the board, there aren't really any races where Republicans are running as explicitly anti-Trump candidates. Even the more quote unquote establishment candidates are running as Trump supporters. It's just more on like certain issues, like I'd say Ukraine funding. That has kind of been a more of a dividing line, or immigration. So another interesting race I was watching last night was in Alabama. You had two Republican members who were forced to run against each other in the same district due to another round of redistricting. So this is in like southern Alabama, in a district that's anchored in Mobile. And the current Mobile representative, Jerry Carl, was thought to be the slight favorite just because he represented a larger portion of this new district and had been in Congress since 2020. But he faced Barry Moore, who was a member of the Freedom Caucus. They're both very conservative. They're both Trump supporters. But Moore comes from a different wing of the party. And he was going after Carl on the issue of Ukraine funding, for example. And Moore ended up barely winning Tuesday night, which was interesting to watch. That was a win kind of for the more MAGA wing of the party. And then there were a lot of other open seats where you saw some of the more MAGA affiliated candidates win. You also saw there were a couple of races where the more quote unquote establishment Republican was more successful. So I would say across the board, it was kind of a mixed bag.
Okay. Well, it's interesting how this is going to shake out over these next few months. And still, like we've been saying throughout this interview, a long way to go before we get to November. But it's always a good idea to head over to the Cook Political Report if this kind of thing interests you and you want to kind of get to know the lay of the land and, kind of where the mood of the country is with certain candidates. And you're always getting a good look at where the different candidates stand in terms of these different states that are really going to mean something in November. Everybody's vote means something in every state. But of course, we're looking at some of these battleground states as really being the key deciders of the 2024 election. So make sure you're going to the Cook Political Report on a regular basis to check out all that. And you can read all of Erin Covey's stuff there as well by following her on her Twitter, her X, on whatever word it is we're calling it these days, at ER Covey. Erin, thank you for joining me on the DC Debrief.
Yeah, thanks for having me.